Good. So, dear friends, Jess and myself, if we would give an honest summary of this 2019 State of the World talk, is quite simply, we're failing. We know that the food system, clearly being the most important sector for human well-being, is stuck there between a rock and a hard place. Culprit number one in terms of the challenges we're facing, victim number one in terms of the pressures caused by all human-induced unsustainable and unhealthy pressures. But also, interestingly, solution number one. And the drama is rising. Right recently, we had the IPCC 1.5 report that laid on the table the transition we need to face in terms of climate. And quite recently, we had the IPBES report, the first global assessment on biodiversity and ecosystem services. And if you put these two, what we would argue being the most important scientific assessment we have today, together on one table, we have the scientific evidence for a planetary emergency. This emergency is now very concrete. The IPCC report shows very clearly that 1.5 degrees Celsius warming is not like any number in terms of what we can cope with in the economy. Oh no, it's a point beyond which we risk triggering biosphere feedbacks that could take us to a hothouse Earth trajectory when the planet takes over and moves us irreversibly towards a world that can no longer support humanity and food systems. We simply need to stay well below 2 degrees Celsius warming. What does this mean? It means bending the global curve of emissions no later than next year, 2020, and cutting emissions by half by 2030. This is the transformational journey that Gunnar pointed out and Peter Eriksson pointed out in the beginning. But not only that, we know that it's in the next 5 years that we determine whether we've consumed the remaining global carbon budget, and we know that the food system is the sine qua non if we will succeed or fail with that transition. But we also know that we've entered the sixth mass extinction of species. The IPBES report is so dramatic. We are losing 1 million plant-animal species at risk of extinction over the next decades. We know that we've lost 60% of vertebrates, animal species, over the last 40 years. This is a point of potential life support disruption that, when you link it with the climate challenge, puts us at this transformational stage. And as if that is not enough, we have the health challenges facing us as well.
Has Johan scared you? So let's make it a little scarier. When we look at the malnutrition in all its forms, we know that the problem is universal and massive. We have 821 million people who go to bed hungry every night. While that was declining over 2 decades, the number is going up over the last 3 years, reversing a lot of the progress that the global community has achieved. We have 150 million children who are chronically undernourished or stunted. They will never reach their full potential. That number might not seem a lot, but it's actually roughly 20% of the world's children under the age of 5. 50 million children continue to be wasted or acutely malnourished, which puts them at very high risk of mortality due to seasonal hungers, natural disasters, conflict. And 2.1 billion people, 2.1 billion adults are overweight and obese, and that number is rising. If we don't do anything about it, by 2030, 1 in 2 people will be malnourished in the world. A lot of you have seen these numbers, but they're still shocking. Interestingly, the World Economic Forum Global Risk Perception Survey looked at risks, impact and likelihood of global risks, and in the top 4 are environmental risks. This is the biggest concern globally. Food crisis also is high, but not as high as what we're seeing with the environmental trends. So we're clearly in a situation where food and environment are considered massive global risks to society.
And this was put on the table here at the EAT Forum. And in fact, emerging from the dialogues at the previous EAT Forum, actually 3 years back, this question was put on the table. How can we feed 10 billion people by 2050 within a safe operating space of a stable and resilient planet, planetary boundaries, with healthy food to avoid mortality and shortened life expectancy. So actually that emerged from our dialogues together here, which resulted in taking off on the EAT-Lancet report, which is the first time ever health science, sustainability science, and agricultural research gets together to do a global assessment on trying to put scientific targets on healthy diets from sustainable food systems in a universal analysis. And I had a tremendous privilege to co-chair this with Professor Walt Willett from Harvard, who's here, and having Jess and many of you as joint friends and colleagues in this major global assessment with over 30 leading scholars from different disciplines across the world. We worked hard for 3 years to come up with the scientific targets for healthy diets from sustainable food systems to be the science that then can feed into business, communities, cities, development across the world. Now, we did this on the health side and on the sustainability side by applying a whole set of different methodologies, from modeling to data scanning to mapping off and synthesizing cohort studies, randomized trials, long-term studies from the health sciences. And I think it's fair to say, despite that science is continuously advancing, that this is the best assessment we have today of what does the state of science say in terms of healthy diets from sustainable food systems. We adopted for the first time a new conceptual framework, recognizing that we are in the Anthropocene, the new era where we humans are the dominating force on Earth, both on the sustainability side, taking an Earth system perspective on the food system, but also on the health side, recognizing, for example, at the global burden of disease work that you just was part of leading, that we are today at a global pandemic level in terms of the risks that we face in terms of unhealth related to food. So this is the framework we took. We thereby were able to explore on the health side, across all food groups, the different human boundaries from whole grains to vegetables, fruits, proteins, the whole set of elements that defines a healthy diet. And Jess will come back to the numbers here. But then we also took on the planetary boundaries, asking the question, what are the primary causes for risks in terms of unsustainable developments in the world related to the food system? And that these are biodiversity, land, water, nitrogen, phosphorus, and climate. So it's not only a climate issue, it's a systemic issue related to all challenges we're facing on planetary sustainability. And on the health side.
So what did the group come up with? Again, this was led by the great Professor Walter Willett and the team working on the commission. This is the healthy diet. This is the reference diet in much of its controversy and debate, and we'll talk about that a bit more later. Just to highlight a few things, obviously what many other reports have shown, we need to increase whole grains, fruits, vegetables, legumes, healthy nuts, seeds, and reduce the amount of protein sources, particularly red meat and red processed meat, the salted, cured meats like prosciutto and mortadella and meatballs, which are so good. So it's really limiting those, and we'll come back to why that's so important. Just so you know, this is what it looks like on the plate. Half the plate's fruits and vegetables, whole grains, plant-based proteins, and minimizing sugar, red meats, and starchy vegetables. And it's something to take note of that this diet was constructed age 2 and above. Under 2 children have special needs for growth and development, so these were not included in the diet. Now, the interesting thing is, what does that mean for food production? What does that mean for landscapes and farms? Well, if you look at this graph, it's showing you 2050, business as usual, full food waste and loss, no changes there, is shown in yellow. And green is the 2050 planetary health diet, this flexitarian diet, with having food loss and waste. And just look at the changes that you'd see. We would stay no increasing production of whole grains by 2050 with the planetary health diet. We would see increases in vegetables, fruit production, fish coming from aquaculture, legumes and nuts, and a significant decrease in red meat production. This is what the planetary health diet looks like. Sonia from the commission took a snapshot of what one day of the Planetary Health Diet looks like. Pretty delicious. You see animal source foods on that plate, but smaller amounts, but lots of fruits and veggies, whole grains, nuts and seeds. And just to show that this is a sample of different planetary health diets, of what it could look like on your plate. Obviously, lots of color, lots of different varieties to meet nutrient needs. And all of these plates were modeled to look at nutrient adequacy, and they did fulfill all of the micronutrients, all the macronutrient requirements of a healthy diet. And this diet is meant to be adapted for different cultures, different traditions, depending on where people live. It's not a constructed cookie-cutter approach. It's meant to be used to be creative in different cuisines. So we need to keep that in mind as we look at the diets. So just where's the world at when we look at this reference diet, and what are people in actuality eating? So this is globally what people are eating compared to the reference diet, which is the hatched circles. You can see that in the world, people are consuming way too much red meat and way too much starchy vegetables. Now take a look at the lovely North America, where I'm from. We really blow everybody out of the water with our red meat consumption. We blow everybody out of the water on many things these days. We won't go there. Chicken, egg, red meat, starchy vegetables, not the ideal diet for health reasons, very low in fruits and vegetables, legumes, and nuts and seeds. Take a look at sub-Saharan Africa. High starchy vegetables, a lot of maize, a lot of rice, a lot of cassava, minimal fruits and vegetable intake, and a lot of this in sub-Saharan Africa being still a rural place. Supply chains don't often work to get these perishable foods to the places in need. And this is one of the conundrums that we face with the commission, in that in some places, people are consuming way too much, way beyond what they need for health and for the planet. And other places don't get enough. So we are just seeing these massive inequities in the system of people getting access to healthy foods. Obviously, in places like Africa, particularly for growing children, they need animal source foods. They need those chicken, the eggs, the dairy to help them grow and develop. South Asia, very similar, almost meeting the reference diet in the starchy vegetables, but still not enough of the good stuff. And when we modeled the impacts of this reference diet on diet-related mortality, we did 3 different comparison models, and all 3 really came up roughly with the same result, in that we avert around 11 million deaths, adult deaths per year, which is a reduction of about 19 to 25% of deaths globally.
I must say, I find this graph and finding so incredibly powerful. You pointed out just before we came up here on stage, Jess, that what this shows scientifically is that what is supposed to nourish us is killing us. And that's quite extraordinary that we have now the numbers that a transition to a planetary health diet is a pathway towards a healthy future for humanity, and that this is not a uniform diet, it's a universal framework and a right for all human well-beings, also in terms of equity. Now on the sustainability side, it's equally exciting. We've been advancing the planetary boundary science for 10 years, and now for the first time we're able to put the scientific targets. What's the food system responsibility for humanity to be able to stay within the safe operating space on Earth? And these numbers cut across the key areas that regulates the sustainability of ecosystems, of biomes, and the planet at large. And of course, climate is there. Of course, water is there. Of course, land is there. And of course, biodiversity is there. But also how we interfere with the global cycles of nitrogen and phosphorus, the fertilizers we put in excess in food systems in North America, in China, in Europe, and in Australia, but where we have a deficit use in particularly African nations, part of South Asia and Latin America. Here's again a justice issue, because we load with fertilizers. This leaches into pollution that eutrophies our freshwater systems, which which actually leads to tipping points, dead zones, anoxic events, killing off all marine life and aquatic life in ecosystems, ruining the resilience of the Earth system. We got the numbers here. We're able actually to do quite some interesting conclusions and guidance for business and communities and cities in the world. For example, here on climate, we say the following: the food system in the world must become fossil fuel free. That is the gray curve here. On the y-axis, you have emission of greenhouse gases and carbon dioxide. You see we need to bend the global curve by 2020 and become essentially fossil fuel free by mid-century. That's the gray curve. We say the world will actually succeed in delivering this legally binding promise in the Paris Agreement. Then the food system will also have to invest in sustainable intensification to go from a source in dark red to become a sink in dark green. An agricultural revolution. And as Peter Eriksson pointed out, we have so many of the solutions there, from conservation zero-tillage systems to different forms of integrated ecosystem management approaches to really bind carbon and build ecosystem management approaches. But not even that is enough. We can no longer expand agriculture to feed humanity because we must keep the green and blue here, the natural ecosystems' resilience and ability to sequester carbon. We say all of this will be achieved, but then what's left is how much of non-CO2 gases do we have to accept in order to be able to provide the planetary health diet for the world. And that is the red and yellow bands here of methane and nitrous oxide. And we say that the food system will have a cap of 5 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalents, which is the minimum amount in our assessment of methane and nitrous oxide that the food system will have to have as an allowance to be able to feed humanity, 10 billion people by 2050. What does this mean? It means that other sectors must decarbonize even faster because food is so important. So that's the kind of assessment we did. We took that to a point of laying out the different pathways we have so we can eat healthy diets, the reference diet, the planetary health diet that Jess just summarized. We can reduce food waste, and we can invest in different levels of sustainable intensification. The transition of an unsustainable to a sustainable, recycling, carbon sequestering food system. We put all this into a modeling framework, and it gives the following result. Now, don't worry about the messiness in this graph. There are two key take-home messages. On the y-axis up here, you have the planetary boundaries from greenhouse gases, land use, land expansion, water use, nitrogen, phosphorus, and biodiversity loss. If we're in the red, we're in a danger zone. We want to be in the green to be in a safe operating space. The upper line here is business as usual. So you continue as today, what Jess showed earlier in the yellow points, just continue as business as usual with full waste and no shifts in diets. So production continues as usual, diets as usual, and you see we end up in the red right across all the planetary boundaries. So that will take us, to put it simple, we will fail on Paris, we'll fail on SDGs. The only way to take us to a safe operating space is the furthest down here, where we have a full investment in sustainable intensification, the PROD+, a full reduction of halving food waste, and adopting the planetary health diet. If we can do all of this, we're able to, according to this analysis, to bring ourselves back within a safe operating space. So in summary, yes, we can feed humanity by 2050 within a safe operating space, but it's a sustainability transformation. Reducing food waste, adopting a planetary health diet, and investing in sustainable intensification. That's our task. It's an integrated systems transition. Now that is the result of the Commission. A few things we did not cover.
Okay, so let's get into the nitty-gritties. So what did the Commission do, and what did it not do? So one thing it did, it's established consensus among 37 scientists, which is very hard to do over 2 years. A lot of debate, a lot of arguing, some tears were shed, but consensus came about.
I think it was 3 years in the end, actually.
3 years, yeah. It seemed like a decade. No, just kidding. We set scientific targets, and someone had to do it. Gunhild mentioned that. Someone had to be brave, come up with what is the best global diet, and how do we stay within the planetary boundaries? Setting targets is important because it sets up a roadmap, something where people can start to move towards. But the minute you put numbers to things, it gets very controversial and people start to poke holes in it.
And someone had to do it, and you asked us to do it. And of course it's controversial, but we need it because we need these guardrails in this high-risk situation we're in. However, just to kind of, not to defend ourselves, but just to say that scientific targets is one thing, science-based targets is something else. And I think that's where you need to help us to translate the science into operational, quantitative targets that can work for different economic sectors in society. And I see Peter Bakker sitting in the next corner here with the World Business Council. I mean, you've been working with this for years and years. We Mean Business and Nigel Topping and the network is now starting to take on science-based targets for the Earth system, where the food transition can be one such pathway. So we're only providing the EAT-Lancet report as an entry point for that science-based target work.
And it's sparking political and scientific debate, and that's exactly what we wanted it to do. We knew that we would be on the chopping block when we did this, but that was what we were willing to do, that as a commission, and to really get people talking. And we think that it has inspired a lot of organizations to come up with their own work plans, their own work strategies of how they work with the world and how they work within themselves. We've seen a lot of conversations around organizations, countries thinking about how do they take this EAT-Lancet and its global loftiness and make it relevant for them. And that's exactly what we wanted. And it got a lot of people thinking, and people, I mean citizens. People started to think about their diets. My dad is thinking about eating less meatballs, for example. I'm kidding. But really, it's really getting a lot of consumers to make the links that what they eat is also important for the environment. What it did not do, here we go, Johan. It did not set a time frame or a price tag to make these transformations.
And in a way, it didn't do that because the time is now.
That's right. We're in an emergency situation. So the time frame is now. We're running out of time. We need to make massive grand transformation, which we'll talk about in a minute. It didn't take on the entirety of the food system. It looked at food production, what's happening on farms, in oceans, on ranches, and it looked at consumers' diets. It didn't take into account the whole in-between, food supply chains, as food is stored, processed, packaged, and moved to markets. And it didn't really look at the food environments, the places where consumers engage with the food system. They walk into a store, they walk into a restaurant, and they have to make a decision. It didn't really look into that at all, because we would have been together for a decade.
Another decade.
It didn't really examine actor behavior in much depth. What does it really mean for consumers to switch to this flexitarian diet? What does it mean for the US rancher to move towards more sustainable practices? What does it mean for a government to create a food policy that has sustainability within it? We didn't really delve into the malleability of behavior change and what it means for people as they shift. And we acknowledge that. And it didn't focus really on the economic impacts. And some of the launches we've done in Ireland, in the United States, and other places, there's real concern about livelihoods of farmers and how a potential shift, moving towards more sustainable production practices or a massive shift in diets, what would that look like for the livelihoods of many in Africa, Asia, North America, Europe, and Latin America?
And there's been some debate issues regarding key misconceptions. I think these are two of the most classic ones. The first one is that we talk very clearly in the EAT-Lancet Commission of providing scientific support for a universal framework for a healthy diet from sustainable food system, and it's become often very wrongly interpreted as being a uniform framework, meaning that it's a one-size-fits-all type definition of what we're supposed to eat. Nothing can be more wrong. We're setting the scientific targets of what does science say could be best for all human beings on planet Earth. Secondly, there is this misconception that have we fiddled with the planetary boundaries to adapt them to the health? On the contrary, we did exactly the reverse. We set, based on science, the best assessment on healthy diets, And then we independently define the sustainability targets for a stable Earth system, and then we place the healthy diets inside the safe operating space. So that is just good to get that straight.
So in the report, which I'm sure every one of you has read, and it's 49 pages of galore, we recommend 5 strategies, and this work was led by Professor Tim Lang, who's sitting in the audience. First strategy was to seek international and national commitment to shift towards healthier diets. Bold, big, global. We need governments to govern the food systems. We need the private sector to engage. We need citizens to engage. Of course, governments set policies. We need hard and soft policies. But we also need nudging and inspiration for citizens to shift their diets. And what does it mean for them? Taste, cost, convenience. We need to be thinking about how consumers are getting their food and what drives them to make dietary choices. So we need different types of shifts towards healthy diets, but be thinking about the range of different actors and behaviors that will take to make that shift. We also need to reorient agriculture priorities from producing high quantities of food, which was successfully done over decades and decades. Famines are on the decline. We don't see the massive famines that we saw in Ethiopia, India, and Bangladesh into the 19th century. Towards healthier foods, we need to completely reshift our production practices. We need to completely reshift R&D and agriculture to move more towards the perishable foods, the fruits, the vegetables, animal source foods, and move away from the continued growth of staple grains like maize, rice, and wheat, which subsidy policies support that. To those that are producing healthy food, and many of you may have heard the World Food Prize winner was just announced from the Netherlands, who's a vegetable seed producer. So pretty exciting to see the nutrition theme continue with the World Food Prize, which traditionally always focused on producing more food to feed the world, but not really addressing feeding the world well.
So we all recognize that we're facing a transformation. We're also discussing, and the EAT Forum has become the platform in the world to really discuss unleashing innovation, disruptive solutions in the space of equity and health and sustainability in food. But we also recognize in the report that we need to unleash this through incentives by regulating and having stronger governance. That we need to not only raise food to the highest policy level, and now of course 2019, 2020 is a key period with the climate summit, with the CBD big meeting in China next year, and 2020 being this pivotal point on policy towards sustainable development goals, but we also need to support coordinated action on governance. No doubt we need to have ideas and how to scale reduction of food waste across the whole value chain, putting, for example, a price on food externalities as a way of reducing food waste. We need to also have an agricultural revolution in terms of investing in sustainable intensification in food systems. It's incredibly exciting, the discussions at the EAT Forum here already on potentially inspired by the EAT-Lancet Commission setting up a sustainable intensification commission led by the CGIAR and the Waterland Ecosystem Program. One of these enormously important transitions we need to see of shifting the whole logic in agricultural systems across the world. Now, just as a final slide to kind of inspire, hopefully, the discussions coming out of the EAT-Lancet report for our deliberations today and tomorrow. What is then the path forward? We've identified 6 areas that kind of emerge already from the EAT-Lancet launches we've had and the dialogues we've had. One is that, inspired by the EAT-Lancet Commission, there is an global commons alliance with the World Resources Institute, with the World Economic Forum, with the Global Environment Facility and partners around the world to set up an Earth Commission and to translate this into science-based targets for human development within a safe operating space. So take the EAT-Lancet up one level and put the food system and development within a global people-planet agenda. We also have the discussion we had earlier of translating the EAT-Lancet science target into science-based targets. And this is a really exciting development, and we look forward to follow that up with many of you in dialogues over the next couple of days. David Nabarro is leading the Global Food System Dialogue that is really taking shape and scale, and now is the moment to really help each other to accelerate this even further, backed up with the science. It's fantastic that we now have a lot of the tools to make these science-based dialogues really curate them and shape them. We see measurement opportunities and Earth observation discussions, both in oceans and on land, to quantify and follow not only risks, but also map out solutions. We're working on an exponential roadmap, for example, for the Climate Summit, on how can we disrupt and transform in an exponential way different sectors in society. And finally, understanding the whole food economics, which will also be a discussion here at the EAT Forum, putting a price tag not only on the costs of inaction, but also the benefits economically of action. Can you imagine the money we save by saving 11 million lives per year? So this is just a few examples of issues arising from the EAT-Lancet Commission. As just pointed out, this is a starting point, but it's also thanks to you that we took it off, but it's also with you that we can take it further. So we're so privileged to have this opportunity together to share the scientific findings and hopefully have this as a trigger point for the next steps together. So thank you so much, and looking forward to 2 very exciting, dynamic days. Thank you.
Thank you.